through the slide deck I have, which coincidentally starts by answering that very question.
Perfect.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Again, Becky, Brandon, and I wrote this. Brandon is a sort of political veteran in Pennsylvania. So the reason that we wrote this is because we've been paying attention to what Donald Trump has been saying. Throughout the last few months, Trump has said repeatedly that he may not accept the results of the election. And he's argued that the election needs to be called on election night, that we have to, stop the count, and that any ballots that are cast after, or that are counted after November 3rd are fraudulent. And a lot of people have dismissed, what Trump has been saying, either because they think that he's all talk, or because they think that there are appropriate constitutional guardrails in place to prevent Trump from stealing the election. They think that, a president has to accept the results of the election. The premise of this guide, though, is that we should take Donald Trump at his word, that when he says he won't accept the results of the election if he loses, that he means that, and that we should prepare for a protracted conflict after Election Day. And what we sort of decided to write this because we started researching the landscape on this and realized that there is actually a clear pathway for Trump and the Republicans to steal the election if they're determined enough and if they're willing enough to break constitutional norms. So we're saying, all signs point to a Biden landslide, but we, know from 2016 that it's possible for the polls to be wrong. And in any event, we should prepare for worst case scenario, since it's, there's no cost to us preparing and nothing happening. But if we're caught flat-footed, we're in a real risk of losing our democracy. So a quick caveat here at the top is that we're political strategists, not legal experts. Our goal is to describe the political dimension of a contested election and lay out a political strategy for addressing it. We expect that the Biden campaign and the Democratic Party at all levels will have a legal strategy. But as I'll discuss at length later, a legal strategy really isn't enough to win in a contested election. So the first section I want to walk through, and Stacey, feel free to sort of pause me at the end of this if you want to take some questions or if we want to dig in on anything I cover here, is to talk about how in a normal election year, in a non-contested election, we actually elect our presidents. So there's a common misconception among some voters. I'm sure most people watching this, know how, at least some of how this process works, but it's a common misperception that we vote for the president, when in fact we vote for people called electors, who then in turn, they're collectively referred to as the Electoral College. They vote to choose the president. So on November 3rd, in a close election, we're unlikely to know which candidate won. And that's because there are going to be delays in counting mail-in ballots. And so it may take days or weeks before we have counted enough ballots to actually know who will win. The first date after November 3rd that's really important is called the safe harbor deadline. It's on December 8th. And federal law creates a strong incentive for states to complete their ballot count on or by December 8th. This isn't a hard deadline. States are permitted to continue counting after December 8th, but if they complete their count by December 8th, they're guaranteed by federal law that Congress will accept the results of the election. If they miss this date, there's a risk that Congress will reject their electoral college votes. By December 14th, the governor in each state is required to report to Congress which candidates or electors are appointed to the electoral college. And then on December 14th, the electoral college itself meets. In each state, the winning candidate's slate of pledged electors meet, typically in the state house. They cast their votes and they send a record of their votes to Congress. On January 3rd, the new Congress is sworn in. So the current Congress will not be the one to count the electoral college votes. It'll be the new Congress, including members who are elected or re-elected as a result of the November 3rd election. And then on January 6th, the Congress convenes in a joint session held in the House chamber to count electoral college votes and choose the next president. I want to pause here to be really clear that until Congress counts and accepts the electoral college votes on January 6th, we have not determined who the winner of the presidential election is. So voters play a role in this process. The electors themselves play a role in this process, but we should understand, particularly for the sake of the contested election, that it's Congress that chooses the president. And finally, on January 20th, Inauguration Day, the newly elected president and vice president are sworn in. If there's not a president, then the newly elected vice president is sworn in as acting president. And if we have neither a president nor a vice president, then Congress, or then the Speaker of the House is sworn in as acting president. So the reason a lot of people don't know about this stuff is because it's all typically ceremonial, not in any way disputed. It's uncontroversial, right? The governor, just ceremonially appoints the electors, and the count in Congress is not in contention. But the risk is that those two parts of the process break down in significant ways. And what I'm going to do next is talk about that. But Stacey, should I pause here or should I continue?
Well, I'd love to understand a little bit more. One of the things that struck us at Income Movement when we were reading through it and talking through what the implications here are, it was interesting that there's kind of almost like a philosophical or stance that you're asking people and our democratic leadership to take and to understand. And this idea that, one, we should be anticipating Trump's likely attempt to try to create chaos, that chaos is kind of at the center of this, and that we need to prepare for what our reaction to the chaos is, right? How can we minimize chaos around during these really kind of key peak times? You also talk about this idea that maybe for the first time in most of our lives, we are going to need to make a decision on how much of a hardball game are we willing to play. And I think that those two things are really interesting. I'm sure it's probably what you're going to bring up here, but the kind of psychological shift that we have to make in order to prepare and then also be able to kind of take the right action at the right time and be willing to maybe go to places we haven't had to go to, because we know Democrats generally want to play nice and they want to think the best that the system is going to support itself. I just want to make sure that those two pieces are really kind of integrated, because I think it's such an important part of this conversation for us as people, how we need to start thinking about things now.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of our main motivations in releasing the guide before the election is to help people psychologically prepare for this, because the scenario that we're facing is such a drastic departure from standard democratic process. And in fact, the appropriate way to think about what I'm about to talk about here in the next section is that this isn't an election. We refer to this as a contested or disputed election, but this isn't an election. It's an attack on our electoral system, right? And what we're talking about is fending off a frontal assault on our electoral system in order to preserve and defend the Constitution, right? As soon as some of the stuff that I'm about to talk about happens, this stops being an election and Trump stops being a candidate. And what this is an autocratic attempt to undermine and destroy the Constitution. So I think that's a pretty good segue into sort of mapping out how the crisis might unfold in relationship to the timeline that I just laid out.
Perfect.
So an important piece of context is what we call the red mirage. So unlike most recent presidential elections, we are not likely to know the winner on election night. And this is significant because there's a partisan disparity in who votes by mail, right? So Democrats are far more likely to vote by mail than Republicans are. And so in a close election, it's possible that Trump will lead on the election night returns because the in-person voting is counted faster and the in-person voters are more likely to be Republicans, even though once all the ballots are counted, he'll have lost decisively. It gives him an incentive to declare victory on election night and say that we should stop counting ballots and certify the election night returns, even though those are partial returns that don't reflect the actual will of the people. And we have a preview of this in the way that he talked about the Florida recount in 2018. So in 2018, there was a razor-thin margin in the Florida gubernatorial and Senate races such that the state had to conduct a recount. And ultimately, Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis won their races, but their lead shrunk significantly. And before the recount was completed, while their leads were shrinking, Trump tweeted that the, quote, ballots were massively infected in Florida and that the recount was essentially fraudulent and the ballots that were being counted were forged, and then called on state election administrators to certify the election night returns. And this is exactly what we were expecting in this election, is that on November 3rd, the beginning of Trump's attack on our electoral system will be a declaration of victory. He'll say, the election night returns have me in the lead. Any ballots counted after this are fraudulent. Then his campaign will immediately attempt to delay and disrupt the ballot count. They'll do this using two sort of categories of tactics. The first are legal and administrative challenges, right? They'll actually try and legally tie up or force to be disqualified ballots in key swing states. And it's also likely that Trump will incite violence by his supporters, right? He's already done this. We heard him from the debate stage, call on his supporters to be quote unquote poll watchers, which what that means, let's be real, is intimidating voters and trying to get them not to vote. We can expect the same thing after the election, that he'll incite violence against election administrators and potentially try and disrupt the count itself. And so in the worst case scenario, one or more contested states will fail to complete their ballot count before the safe harbor date and before the Electoral College meets on December 14th. This is where sort of the things get really crazy is, before December 14th, we would expect that the Democratic governor in a key swing state like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan, right, which is the other states where this is most likely to break down, we'd expect that they would appoint the lawful Biden electors. And then what could happen is the Republican legislatures in those states, right, all three of those states have a Democratic governor and a Republican-controlled legislature, as does North Carolina. The legislature would meet and would argue that, the election has essentially failed, that as a result of chaos caused by Trump and his campaign and his supporters, or because the ballot count was significantly delayed, or even because of their baseless assertion that the ballot count was contaminated by fraud, they would argue that they have to appoint a slate of Trump electors to the Electoral College. And to be clear, that's illegal. They're not allowed to do that. But as I'll talk about in a minute, that may not be enough to stop this from causing a constitutional crisis. And so what we mean by contested election is that in one or more contested states, rival slates of electors, one for Biden and one for Trump, meet on December 14th. They vote for the candidate to which they're pledged. They send competing slates of electors to Congress. And at that point, it's left to Congress to decide which slate of electors to count and which to discard. And as I'll talk about more in a moment, the law that governs this is virtually untested and quite convoluted. So it's unclear exactly how this type of dispute would be resolved. And again, if we don't have a president or a vice president chosen on or before January 20th, then the Speaker of the House will be sworn as the acting president. So to draw out of this, there are two things that we consider triggers for a constitutional crisis. The first is if Trump and his allies launch a bad faith attempt to prevent every ballot from being counted, right? So, the media may treat, Trump's lawsuits and administrative challenges or violence by his supporters as random or as a legitimate dispute over the legality of ballots. But we have to be clear, if the Trump campaign, as we expect it to, launches a coordinated attempt to suppress votes from being counted, that is not a legitimate campaign tactic or something that happens within the realm of an election. That is an attack on our democratic system, and we consider it one of the triggers for a constitutional crisis. The second trigger is that in a state that Biden wins, Trump's electors, likely appointed by the state legislature, meet, vote for Trump, and send a record of their votes to Congress. Right, so this is either a bad faith attempt to suppress ballots or an illegal attempt to appoint Trump electors in a state that Biden won. Those are the two constitutional crises that we look for. And at that point, this stops being an election and becomes an attack on our democracy and a fight to defend the Constitution. So all this may sound impossible or highly improbable, but it's happened before. In 1876, 4 states sent competing slates of electors to Congress. And following protracted negotiations, it's only concluded days before the inauguration, Congress reached a political compromise to determine the winner. And the outcome was that President Hayes became the president, and in an exchange, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, Reconstruction ended, and we sort of ushered in the era of Jim Crow. But this was a serious constitutional crisis, and it was unclear whether it could even be resolved. It was only a last-minute political compromise that stopped a complete breakdown of the electoral system. So,
but that compromise also, I mean, what's interesting about that just historically is how significant the compromise, the significant impact on the whole kind of trajectory of the South, right? That happened with that compromise. And so then even just thinking about like, well, what would be on the table for, if it ever came to compromise today, what would the Republicans demand in order for them to, you know, move things forward pre-inauguration is also just another component.
Absolutely. It was, yeah, it was a devastating political compromise. And in many ways, we're still feeling the effects of that constitutional crisis, in that it has shaped, you know, the life outcomes for generations of Americans and shaped our politics in profound ways.
Yeah.
So absolutely, and that's a really important observation. So all this is really terrifying. The good news, though, is that Democrats actually control the key levers of power. And if they have a determination equal to the Republicans to stop Trump from stealing the election, and if they're backed up by a mass protest movement nationwide, it is very probable that Democrats can stop this. They have to do three things, though. First, Biden must not concede. If either of those constitutional crises are triggered, then Biden has to not concede under any circumstances. This may be something that we have to communicate to him publicly, right? We need to be prepared to publicly urge Biden to stay in the race and refuse to concede to Trump under any circumstances if Trump tries to disrupt the ballot count or appoint illegal electors. Second is that governors must appoint Biden electors, even if the vote count is incomplete, right? And I'll talk about this more in a second, but if we have not completed the ballot count by December 14th because Trump and his allies have launched an all-out attack on our electoral system, the Democratic governor in the state that that's happening in needs to give Congress the option of determining that Biden is the legitimate winner of the election. And the only way they can do that is if they appoint Biden electors to the Electoral College. And then third, once the fight moves to Congress, members of Congress have to rally the American people and vote in unison against counting Trump's electors.
You mentioned in the count also for that second bullet there on the previous slide that even though the cutoff is it the 8th of December for the vote counts, that a governor can decide to continue to count votes, even though they might not be legitimately recognized as official counts, but that could be also a tool for a governor who knows that it's going to come to a decision at Congress. Which electors are you going to take? The ones that the governor, Democratic governor is giving, or a Republican state legislature, that can at least give a little bit more credence to the argument that the Democratic governor is making.
Absolutely. In this kind of crisis, what's at stake is democratic legitimacy. And so if the ballot count breaks down, and the governor is forced to appoint Biden electors, even though the count hasn't completed, first, the state should complete the count, absolutely. And Congress can take into account both the completed ballot count if it's done before January 6th, and also can take into account ballots that are discarded, right? There's nothing that stops the Democratic governor of a state from appointing electors based on also the ballots that are illegitimately thrown out or not counted, or stops Congress from considering ballots that are counted after the safe harbor deadline. So absolutely, the ballot count has to be brought to a completion so that we know verifiably who won the election. So, which is another sort of important point, is that it's worth pointing out that what matters in this period while the ballots are being counted may not ultimately be how many ballots are counted, but the public perception of the election. And what Trump is going to be attacking, more than even how many ballots are counted or what the result of that count is public perception about the integrity of the election, right? Because all the Republicans need is a pretext to appoint fraudulent electors. And what's amazing is that the Republicans may break the law, but that doesn't mean they won't win, right? Our system is held together by good faith and by norms. And crucially, and this is a really important point, is even illegally appointed electors' votes can likely be counted by Congress. So if the legislature illegally appoints Trump electors, then Congress could, in theory, still count those electors. The firewall against that happening is norms and a shared commitment to the system, not actually laws. So we don't know because this scenario has never really played out. So it's possible the Supreme Court intervenes, but our best read of the situation is that, and what we should prepare for is that it'll be a political resolution in Congress. And I want to draw this out too, is the scenario where the vote count has not been completed by December 14th, there will be enormous pressure on a Democratic governor to appoint Trump's electors if he's ahead in a partial vote count, or not to appoint electors at all. But we have to be clear, if the ballots have not been counted by December 14th because Trump prevented them from being counted, he's forfeited his right to win an electoral college majority. And Democratic governors should act swiftly to appoint Biden electors, even if, as a result of Republican meddling, Trump holds an illegitimate and partial lead in a partial vote count. If they don't do that, then it becomes increasingly difficult to win the fight in Congress. Finally, Stacey, as you pointed out, the safe harbor deadline is artificial, and we should count the ballots, even if it means that we go all the way to January 6th.
Becky has joined us in the last couple of minutes. Hi, Becky. How are you?
I'm good. Sorry I'm late, but I'm enjoying the presentation.
No problem. Well, you missed my introduction of you, but we did an introduction at the beginning so people know a little bit more about who you are and the kind of political experience and chops you brought with Zack to the count. So really happy to have you here, and yeah, looking forward to you joining in with the answering audience questions in a few minutes.
Thank you.
So moving on to when the fight gets to Congress. So again, what we're presuming here is a situation where one or more states have sent competing slates of electors to Congress, one for Trump and one for Biden, and the outcome of the election hinges on which of those slates of electors is counted. So the Constitution itself doesn't prescribe a process for resolving this type of dispute. In fact, it doesn't anticipate that something like this would ever occur. The Electoral Count Act of 1887, which was passed following the 1876 election, is famously convoluted and has never been used to resolve a contested election. So we don't really know what would happen legally in this kind of situation because that law has never been tested. It's pretty clear that the Electoral College Count Act says that if the Senate and the House can't agree, or that if there's a dispute over electors, the Senate and the House vote separately on how to resolve that dispute. If both the Senate and the House come to an agreement, it's pretty clear that how they agree to count the votes will stand. But if the Senate and House can't agree on how to resolve a dispute, which is likely to happen if Democrats don't win the Senate, then things become a little murkier. So one interpretation of the Electoral Count Act, and this is the sort of mainstream interpretation, is that if the Senate and House can't agree, then the governor's slate of electors are counted. And so this is a favorable interpretation in most scenarios for us, because we can assume that in most disputes, you'll have a slate of electors who are for Biden who've been legitimately appointed by the governor, and an illegitimate slate appointed by the legislature. And so if the two chambers can't agree and the governor's slate is counted, then those are likely to be Biden electors. However, there's another interpretation that says that both slates are simply discarded. That would then trigger a dispute over whether or not the threshold to win remains or is lowered from 270, which could potentially mean that neither candidate gets an electoral college majority, throwing the decision to the House. It's also possible the Supreme Court intervenes to interpret the Electoral Count Act. In 1876, the Supreme Court did not intervene, and Congress is granted clear constitutional authority to who the president is. That is, court won't intervene to interpret the Electoral Count Act itself, which is not the Constitution, but is a federal law. So it's possible that if Congress can't agree on how to interpret the Electoral Count Act, the Supreme Court will intervene to clarify the interpretation of that law. It's also possible the Supreme Court won't intervene. We really don't know because we haven't been through something like this. Finally, it's possible that Congress will simply deadlock, that the Supreme Court won't intervene, that Congress can't come to an agreement, and that we just don't count the Electoral College votes for potentially a very extended period of time. It's very unlikely that no candidate gets 270 electoral college votes. Currently 538 gives us a less than 1% chance, but because this gets mentioned a lot, I want to talk about it briefly. So again, very unlikely that this happens, but in the event that nobody gets 270 electoral college votes, the House chooses the president by a vote of state delegations. So not by House members, but each state delegation gets a vote based on who controls that delegation. So, I'm in Texas, there are more Republicans in my state delegation than there are Democrats. It's almost certain that Texas would cast one vote for Trump's electors. And then the Senate chooses the vice president by a simple majority. So Democrats are unlikely to control a majority of the state delegation. So while this situation is unlikely, it would be quite bad for Democrats. All of this is, to sum all this up, is that all of this largely takes place in a legal vacuum. These laws are untested, they're vague, the system runs on norms, not really on laws. And if the Democrats act like legal scholars, if they assume that there is an objectively correct legal resolution to this that will be pursued in good faith by the courts, while Republicans wage a guerrilla war to make Trump the president, it is almost certain that the Democrats will lose, even if Joe Biden is the legitimate winner of the election. And so we have to be clear that this is a political fight, not a legal fight. And to that end, there are some extraordinary things that Congress can do. And to be clear, before I talk about these are things that are unprecedented and that typically we would not want members of Congress to do. But the reason to do these is if we're facing a coup, right? If Trump is trying to destroy our election system, then we have to use every institutional mechanism we can and play hardball and use every bit of power that we have to stop him. So one is on January 3rd, when the Senate seats the incoming senators, right? 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election, or 1/3 of the seats are up. Democrats will briefly have a 35-seat majority because there'll be 65 senators, 35 of whom will be in the Democratic caucus. And so the Republicans, or the Democrats led by Chuck Schumer, could delay seating the incoming senators to preserve their 35-seat majority when the Senate votes to count electoral college votes. And so if Democrats don't win the Senate and we're facing a coup, Democrats should do this to ensure they have a majority and can thwart the Republicans' efforts to overturn the will of the people. Second is in, go ahead.
This is super interesting. As I underlined and wrote all kinds of questions around this when I was reading the count. I'm like, okay, this is really fascinating. Do you have a sense of what the actual mechanism that Chuck Schumer and the senators could do, the Democratic leading senators or majority senators at that moment could do to prevent? Is it literally is it a requirement right now that Schumer basically with a gavel welcomes those new senators?
The Senate votes to seat incoming senators. Theoretically, again, this is almost entirely ceremonial and nothing like this has ever happened, right? So this is another untested scenario, and which is why, even if the Democrats don't win the Senate, it's not like they should refuse to seat the incoming senators just to preserve a majority for the sake of legislation, right? Yeah. But again, if we're in a constitutional crisis where the threat is that Trump will subvert the Constitution and usurp the presidency, then an action like this is justified. And it's my understanding that a simple majority of votes, they should be able to delay seating the incoming senators until after they deal with the counting the electoral college votes.
Got it.
Similarly, in the House, there are some hardball tactics. So the Constitution says that the electoral college votes will be counted in a joint session in the House. The Speaker of the House runs the House and could order the Sergeant at Arms to remove Mike Pence and the Senate from the House chamber and argue that because they can't convene in the House, they can't constitutionally count the electoral college votes. Again, completely unprecedented, right? Nothing like that has ever happened. And the legitimacy of this and of the first tactic I just described would of course be challenged for a Republican. But in a crisis, to do everything within our power, even if it's unprecedented, even if it's in violation of norms, because we have to play by the same rules as the Republicans when they're trying to overturn our constitutional order.
When you want the ball in your court, when it goes to, you want to be going into any of those court battles with things headed in your direction. So it puts them on the back pedal, kind of the back step of trying to figure out how to legally make a case for why it is that their position is correct. So it's really about just getting the kind of the upper hand in the moment, so that moving forward, you have kind of the strongest foundation to stand on from like kind of a legal standpoint.
Absolutely. And that's why we have to make the psychological shift from thinking about this as an election if we move into this scenario, and understand that it's a coup, right? Because you wouldn't do things like this in an election, right? That would be wrong. It would violate core democratic norms. But to thwart a coup, of course you would do things like this. And the last thing is, of course, to use civil disobedience. You know, members of Congress can organize mass civil disobedience to shut down the Capitol and delay votes. So just to wrap up very quickly, and then I'm excited to go to audience Q&A and bring in Becky. We have a recent experience of this from 2000, and I'm sure some people remember the 2000 election. Al Gore allowed George W. Bush to steal the election by conceding rather than taking the fight all the way to Congress. There's a common misconception that the Supreme Court decided the 2000 election. It didn't. It decided the outcome of the Florida recount. Had Al Gore listened to some of his advisors and asked his electors in Florida to convene and vote and send a competing slate of electors to Congress, he could have taken the fight all the way to Congress in exactly the way I just described. But he didn't. For the sake of the country, he conceded to preserve national unity. And in many ways, he backed himself into that because his campaign took a different strategy than Bush's. And so Gore put his faith in the legal system, and he even went so far as to tell Democratic organizations to stand down and not to protest, while Bush and the Republicans, you know, actually spoke to the American people and painted Gore as a sore loser and interfered with the ballot count and prevented people's votes from being counted. So even though Al Gore won the 2000 election, he didn't become the president. And we need to make sure that we don't repeat this mistake, right? Republicans have shown that they're more willing to be ruthless, to play hardball, to violate political norms to win, and to take advantage of Democrats when they try to negotiate in good faith. And oftentimes we've seen Democrats fail to meet them and play by the same rules, which in many ways makes sense because Democrats want a system that runs on norms, right? We want a democratically legitimate system. And so we often constrain what we're willing to do, but faced with an opponent who is actually trying to overturn the results of an election and attack the constitutional order, we have to be willing to play by the same rules as the Republicans. And what I've described as the inside game, right? This is the institutional mechanics that Democrats can use to win this type of fight, but all of us need to have their backs. And that means we have to organize massive public outcry to support these kinds of tactics, to support a hardball inside game by Democrats. So briefly, some of the things that you can do, you can go read the guide at thecountguide.com. There's a coalition called Protect the Results that is organizing protests for immediately after the election. We need to be in the streets immediately. And so I urge you to go sign up for these protests, and then to continue protesting, right? We need to be in the streets until Trump is out of the White House, or until he concedes. Reach out to your elected officials, right? This may seem like a fight that's going to happen in the swing states, but because it potentially goes to Congress, and because every elected official has a bully pulpit, we actually need elected officials in all 50 states to prepare for this and use their platform as elected officials to communicate with their constituents and to rally the American people to defend the Constitution. And finally, of course, vote yourself and urge your friends and family in swing states to vote. And one final closing point, and then I'll be done here, is do not wait to be led. There are going to be a lot of great organizations that are organizing people to protest, to take action, but the kind of mass participation that we need, tens of millions of people in the street, can't be organized from the top down. It needs to be organized horizontally. And so we're going to need leadership at all levels, right? This is going to have to be regular people organizing their communities to protest and innovating and figuring out what tactics they need to use in real time. And so don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do. If nobody's telling you what to do or giving you the strategy, you have to be the leader, right? All of the following one. And so don't wait, because if we let Trump get the advantage, if we let him take the initiative, it becomes much harder to protect the Constitution. So you can reach us at hello@thecountguide.com. Feel free to reach out. We would love to talk. And Stacey, I'll kick it back to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is such a great just overview of the count. I know I think I've read the count now 2 or 3 different times going through, and it's each time I read it, I go to it when I'm feeling my most like highest levels of anxiety. To a certain degree, it increases my anxiety, but then it also just, it is incredibly powerful to have a set of clear directives and clear things that I can do, that we can do as a community to feel like we can have an impact, and knowing kind of what are the most important moments and ways to have that impact, I think is just so powerful. So thank you to both of you for writing this and for being here today with us to talk more about it. I think before we get to audience Q&A, there was a lot of questions specifically around where can we go, what organizations are going to help organize people, and and all of that. And so it was great to see that you have a few different organizations that are already on top of this. We know this isn't happening in a vacuum. A lot of people are, in particular over the last month, as it's become more and more clear that Trump may not concede or step down, that there's a real need for some organizing. But I would love to understand, or just talk a little bit more about this idea of, when I was going through this last time, it became so clear how important perception is to this. Perception of the people, perception of the legitimacy and kind of sanctity of the vote count, legitimacy of conceding or not conceding, just all of those components. When I was going through the Democratic officials like steps, it's like Biden must not concede. Biden needs to declare victory if it's looking like a lot of votes are not going to get counted. We have to call this out as Republican fraud, like use the language of what is actually happening to help people on the ground understand what's going on. So I don't know if you talked quite a bit about it, but I just wanted to put that into your guys' kind of court to talk a little bit more about how critical that is and what an important part we can play to help make sure that the perception kind of shift that narrative, especially in the immediate days and weeks after November 3rd.
That's a great question. I mean, I think first and foremost, one of the things that we really need, that we can all do as activists, right, and leaders in our communities is help bolster this narrative by stepping out and saying immediately after the election that there's a clear path to victory for Biden based on the election day results, based on the vote by mail tallies, and based on the polls, and just start that narrative. I think a lot of people will be concerned, and the Biden campaign may even push back about declaring victory. And so we need to step into that void, whether it's how we talk to our friends and family, whether we're asked by the media, and we need to ask our elected officials to stand up there and make it clear that Biden has a clear path to victory and that he's clearly going to be the winner when all the votes are counted. And it means a lot. The same thing with the media. We want the media to make it clear and not push back on the both sidesism, I think that was like brought up in the chat, to push really hard to like get that to be the dominant part of the conversation, and then delegitimize the Republicans, explain them as partisan frauds, as trying to steal the election, and doing this in language that really is relatable. It's not the in-group language, I think, sometimes of left politics. And I think the basic income movement has been such great communicators across all kinds of silos, you know what I mean? And so like making sure that not just where we normally see people interested in the presidential race, but just all across the spectrum of people who care about our government, that people are hearing this, getting language to mimic, and they're saying it again and again and again.
Yeah, and I think Van Jones just posted in the last few days a TED Talk where he talks about the role of concession and the importance, and touches on a lot of the things that you were just speaking to, Becky. And I think one of the things that he mentions is to try to as much as possible for people to depoliticize this and have it be about attacking our Constitution and attacking, the patriotic duty that we have to our codified, government systems, and not have it be about, even about, you know, the language of Trump or, you know, or the Republicans taking the election, but really about how do we make sure that that the Constitution and the role and sanctity of the country is upheld during this time, can also just be powerful ways of uniting and bringing people together around the issue.
I think that's right. And I think there's a lot of talk about leading with values in these conversations, which I 100% agree with, but we also have to say that Biden won. So we also have to make sure that we don't hold ourselves apart from politics. Maybe Biden's not our candidate, you know what I mean? And all these kinds of things. We can't just make it about Trump. We literally have to reinforce that Biden is going to be the next president of the United States, because we need that counterweight to the both sidesism in the press, and to what, you know, what Trump and his allies have been planning, you know, for months, and talking about doing, you know, four months.
So I'm curious to understand, Zach and I were talking about this a little bit before we actually started the conversation around, you know, we're based in, Income Movement is based in Oregon, which is pretty much so a landslide of Democratic leadership. And I'd love to understand from your guys' perspective, what are some of the most important things people who find themselves in a state like ours, where we probably aren't going to have a lot of sway in, or need to make a lot of sway in the outcome of our state. But what could we do to make it so that we're having a big impact and supporting, you know, supporting this push in ways that feel real?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be clear, if this happens, it's a 50-state campaign, right? This is a everyone everywhere campaign to stop it, even though the institutional action will be in swing states and in Congress. This is a 50-state campaign to save the country. And so if you are, and the guide has a long list of things that people everywhere can do, but I'll just sort of recap a few of them. First, of course, communicate with your member of Congress. Since if you have a Democratic member of Congress, or there's even a Democratic member of Congress in your state, right, communicate with them, because we need them to vote the right way. You can also organize your local government, your city council, your county board, to pass resolutions condemning Trump and his allies' attempts to destroy our democracy and to steal the election. And then again, simply protesting shapes the political climate, right? We need people everywhere to say the Supreme Court should not intervene to resolve this unless the 3 justices appointed by Trump recuse themselves from the decision, right? It's illegitimate for the Supreme Court to hand Trump the election if the 3 judges he put on the bench, you know, are part of the decision making. So there's everyone everywhere shapes the context in which this plays out. And, you know, as we sort of indicated in the presentation, you know, the laws that govern this, because there's so few of them and they're so untested, are really downstream of the political climate, and everyone everywhere can help shape the political climate.
Awesome. So do you guys, is there, besides Protect the Result, there's a few people that have actually gone to Protect the Results and are looking at what's happening there and what the options are. But Catherine Maloney asked this question. ProtectTheResults.com seems to be organizing election night and post-election night, but any groups that are organizing peaceful live streaming observers for election night, especially in the high-risk states or localities, is there anything that that people could be doing, or that you know about, around kind of staying unified on election night itself, and kind of preparing for, understanding, right, as things are unfolding, what the next steps are going to be?
I mean, I think that the election day efforts, you know, a lot of the Protect the Vote efforts on election day are really being run by the candidates and the state parties. And so if you want to be part of, like, keeping the peace, you know, I think that's not, they're not always the best with volunteers, but that is where that's being quarterbacked. Color of Change also is an amazing civil rights organization, and they're organizing in a lot of the key jurisdictions where people are not able to get the vote, or there might be violence at the polls. They're organizing people to do mutual aid for the lines, bringing food, bringing chairs, getting people what they need, you know what I mean, providing Wi-Fi, that kind of stuff, sort of on on election night. One of the things that we often learn with these unprecedented election scenarios is that leadership emerges in the moment, right? And that things will be launched the day after the election or the night of the election that don't even exist now, or we'll find out that it's an amazing local group that steps up and not necessarily the national network. So part of what it is responding to what's being organized is sort of more important than any kind of brand name that's been involved in elections, but also to know that if you have an amazing a local elected official that you supported where you live that has been great on basic income, you know, like that person might be your leader on election night, and might be someone that, you know, that you want to say, like, I'm with you, I want you to be bold, and we're going to be behind you. You know what I mean? Let's make sure that we're standing up, you know, for the people in the swing states, or we're dealing with violence here. Look at Portland. You know what I mean? It's not a swing state, but, you know, you could have violence, you know what I mean, happening, and people showing up for Trump in really disruptive ways that will help set the national narrative. And there may be roles for you to be part of showing that that's, you know what I mean, not going to be the dominant narrative in Portland. And that might be like organized by local elected officials. So you really need to find your formations, you know what I mean, where you are. And then also, you know, keep providing context to other people that you know, so they understand the process, they understand what's coming, and you can be part of just not only who's out there doing your part on election night, but be part of, you know, the leaderful movement that we're going to need to respond to whatever comes our way.
Awesome. Yeah. I love that. I love the idea of, you know, especially so many people in the basic income community have been deeply political this year, some for the first time, and have been really tracking down ballot to understand who's thinking about innovative ways to reimagine our economy. And so the idea of aligning now and starting to have those conversations, and on election night with those people that you've already kind of vetted and have relationships with, is really a great opportunity for that local action, and for that, you know, to really be able to kind of get very clear and strong close up, and then be able to project that out at the city level, you know, county up through to the state, and try to make sure people are vocal, and that's part of the narrative that's being discussed. You know, certainly if there were a lot of people who during their acceptance speeches, you know, when they won, talked about this, and it became actually part of the conversation, it could be incredibly powerful to have so many clips over and over and over again of people saying thank you, you know, so much to the voters. And we really hope that as peaceful as this transition happened, and the concession of my, you know, that happens at the presidential level, there may be some ways for us to even now start to help people understand, our leaders know the opportunities that they're going to have to promote that. That's great. Let me see if there's any last. We're coming up towards the top of the hour, and I want to be really thoughtful of your guys's time. But there was one interesting, I think, question that came from our Facebook side of things in the midst. So somebody said from one of the states that does in-person and mail-in ballots, they said it's their first time voting, and should they drop off their mail-in ballot, or would it be more powerful to actually go in and vote in person day of? So for people who have those options, what is your recommendation of when and how they should vote?
I'm hesitant to make a specific recommendation.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, you should check the rules in your specific state. But I think we should assume that whatever the legal process for voting is should stand up. The only thing I'll say is, if you do have a ballot, don't mail it. Go take it somewhere and drop it off.
Yeah.
It's probably too late to mail it. But I don't know that I would, you know, again, with a major caveat that you should check your local election rules. I don't know that there'd be a difference between dropping off a mail-in ballot in a drop box and voting in person, whichever one is easiest for you.
Okay. Yeah, if you're going to volunteer on election day, go ahead and drop it. Volunteer on election day to get out to vote. But yeah, definitely, like the secretaries of state are now saying not to mail it. If you can, drop it off. If you can't drop it off, definitely mail it. But the sooner you get it in, the better. Yeah,
Yeah.
depending on local rules.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I know some people have been asking, you know, are there things that Income Movement can do around letter writing campaigns now and you know, early to help influence our representatives to be able to take this stance. And certainly we are more than happy to do that. I think a lot of what's come out of here has been, and out of the conversation as well as the chat, I think it's a great opportunity for the community to kind of come together and know that we can flood with phone calls and with letters, with emails, our desire to have, no matter where they stand and who they are, have our representatives commit to the idea of a peaceful transfer of power based on fully counted votes in each state and each precinct. So, well, we're coming up at the top of the hour. Are there any last things that you guys want to make sure people leave here with, thinking about, or keeping in mind?
I mean, one thing I would say is that in the last couple years, you know, the basic income movement has been this huge group of people that have actually moved the ball on an incredibly esoteric to some topic, you know what I mean, and propelled a presidential candidate to national norm and put basic income, you know what I mean, at one of the top issues that's being talked about. And so there's no better group of people to tackle a really big, complicated, problem in our country, to get new people involved, to figure out ways that are easily understandable, to talk about something that might be complex and break down that complexity and talk about it to people that maybe have never been involved before. So just remember, if you think that he's not your candidate, this is not necessarily your issue, remember that you are the problem solvers, you know what I mean, that are trying to really save this country from the brink. And this could be a very big problem. And so there might be people in this movement that hold the key, right, to getting from where we are to where we need to be. So just realize that it really may be up to this community, you know, to step up and lead, because you all are part of the sort of the future of how we do politics in America, and in the future of broadening the base of people who feel like they are political leaders.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becky. I think that's such a good note to end it on. I think it is one of the beauties of the basic income community is not only the passion, but the passion to action that we've seen, and that everybody's, you know, there's a lot of very, very well flexed muscles out there in this community of people not only knowing how to, but believing deeply in the impact of action. So, so I love that we're ending it on that note. So thank you so much to everybody who came and watched, and to Becky and Zack for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and most importantly, this amazing guide, The Count, to make it so that we can all have something to refer to when we're feeling overwhelmed or unsure. You know, having those guideposts is amazing. We've recorded all of this. We'll go ahead and post up on YouTube so people can share this far and wide. So anybody who has watched this, definitely, you know, knowledge is power, and this is an important piece of knowledge. So we really hope that everybody shares this far and wide with your communities over the next few days, but also post-election. If things do start to go sideways, we want to make sure that we can right the ship as quickly as possible. So thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, and thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.
Take care.